Tērā, tērā. We are going to our panel discussion now, ably led once again by Manu Caddy. So Kerry Hudson, from the team leader from Soil Conservation, the Gisborne District Council, who we saw earlier, and also joining us for our panel discussion from the Ministry for Primary Industries, we have Mr. Pat Hohenkel. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Manu, kei a koe.
Questions, I'll just give you a chance to say anything on behalf of MPI. Particularly around the emissions reduction plan and or funding for planting natives in Tairāwhiti.
Yeah, g'day, Paddy. Apologies, I'm actually have been crook, so I thought I'd try and join this and put in what I can and what I can help with, based on the fact that my nose is running like a tree and everything else. So apologies for that. I suppose listening to what's being said, I agree with a lot of what's being said as well, and I think there's a real desire around the native and
up straight in the middle.
Planting native and doing a lot more around that. There's been a lot of work done on how we can actually promote more native planting, more native afforestation, and trying to address some of the barriers or some of the real issues, especially a lot of that is around cost and how that can be addressed and how it can be done and how it can be looked at. It's quite enlightening to hear the comments being said about the right tree, right place, right purpose. And I think for a lot of this also, there's another component of that, about willing participants, to make sure everyone's willing to go through this process and get it done. I think that there's a real desire there to get it done right. And there's been a lot of work done, obviously, with the emission reduction plan that's coming through. There's a lot more work and scope around that to try and get the settings right about how to make it work. Because my personal opinion is we don't want a legacy issue where we create long-term problems down the track. Because if you do something now, it could create a legacy issue 50, 60 years down the track or even later. And I think that's becoming even more relevant now with the fact that the carbon prices just in the last few days jumped up to $60 a tonne, which sort of can really drive people's perceptions of how they're going to do things. So I think there's a real desire to get it done and get it done right. And I think it's sort of an ongoing process. So I haven't got much more to say at the moment, just sort of a little bit quick as well. Yeah.
It's great. And thank you. Thanks for joining us. Even I hope you've been tested.
That's all good.
We're isolating and separate in some ways. So yeah, there's some interesting points there. One of the comments made was that the establishment of native species is a great initiative with multiple benefits, but the issue is that the pricing mechanisms don't change absolute greenhouse gas outputs or emissions from major emitters, and neither are they really the science is still being developed around their carbon sequestration capacity. But anyone got comments on that issue?
So I'll send them a note through the emails.
That is a huge issue. Can you hear me, Manu?
Yep, you've got a bit of background, but all good.
Yeah, no, that's a huge issue, Manu. And the thing is here, we can't lose sight of the fact of how expensive it is to establish Indigenous species and how much care they need into the future. But if that's invested properly, that's a huge advantage to all of us, and it's getting the right tree in the right place at the right time. And that's really critical.
One of the things that government has done recently in the last couple of weeks, which didn't quite go exactly to plan, but what they did was they increased the value of carbon credit, and part of that, the reason behind that was to incentivize planting of native species, and we as a nation understand that we are geared in one particular way, which is towards GDP, and it's going to take a lot to turn the ship around from focusing on export and products to focusing on regenerative, sustainable land uses. So there opportunities which we as an institute and some of the communities that we're working with are exploring to inform government, to help government to make some of these decisions that will then be put into policy. So we are involved in a wood transformation, industry transformation advisory group, as a number of others. There are opportunities for us to inform government policy in the years to come through that mechanism. There's opportunities for us to make submissions to the ETS consultation, which takes place from time to time. And certainly there's opportunity for communities to put their hands up and say, look, we think we can do things in a different way. And some of those demonstrations that I put onto my slide there are some of those communities. They're the ones that are the first movers in this space, saying, we know that this can be done inside of our rohe, and we'd like to get some support from government. So I think there are ways that we can do that, both through partnership and through research, science and technology, and working with government. I think looking forward that there needs to be a cohesion between what government decides, what communities want, what the nation can manage in terms of economics. That's a rather complex equation, but there are opportunities for us to do that.
And Kerry, you talked about the erosion-prone nature of land in the district. Have you got a sense of what proportion of land that's currently in pasture or in production forest should really be in permanent forest again?
No, I don't think we've got a number on that, but we have, significant areas that we need to move from farming and plantation forest into permanent. And there are processes available to us. I mentioned the ETS, and I totally agree with what everyone said about the requirement to tweak the ETS with regard to Indigenous forests. That's really critical. And I think there's a joint approach required here, and that's something that everyone wants, and I think it's something everyone needs. So the interesting thing with what you're saying, Manu, is as we go through, for instance, harvesting, there are areas we're identifying that perhaps should go into something permanent, and I think there's a desire to do that. What I think is important there is there are areas that no one's made a great deal of money off that anyway, so let's have permanent forestry on those really sensitive areas. And not only is it providing protection to that land, but it's protecting the land above it. There was one of the slides I showed where we had plantation forestry on good land and reversion on some fairly marginal land. And there's the future. And we've got a patchwork of land uses all been dealt with in a sustainable manner. And the comments Ramona's made about the getting these things right in terms of Indigenous species are quite right. We need to be moving down that path. And the opportunities are arising for us through either the farm environment plan process or the consent process for forest harvesting and afforestation in the future. Those tools are there now. We haven't had them for that long. And there is a very, very good pathway forward to get that right.
So we had Overlay 3A in the Gisborne district, which gave guidance or required landowners to have a plan around planting those most vulnerable areas. Was that included production? That those areas could be harvested in the future. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, it can be areas harvested, but the requirement of that is they must be replanted. And now in the consent process for replanting is what is the species that's going to be best suited to that site. Some of the photos we showed earlier on that Henry and Can't recall the other guy who commented on that. Yeah, we've looked closely at what alternative species there are, and we still need to research out what species are going to grow on some of this really active land adjoining gullies. So we have the opportunity to do that, Manu. When that requirement on land overlay 3A came in, so that's our worst eroding land in this district, there was only exotic forestry available. There's now has been other options available, and that's closed off, but there's quite a lot of reversion going on in that. And certainly as we get into a consent process through the NES, those harvesting and replant requirements can certainly look closely at what is the most suitable species into the future after harvesting.
So between the MPI and GDC and maybe Scion, you could have a similar map as you did with overlay 3A to say, actually, these areas should never be harvested. They really need to go into permanent.
Yes, cover. Yeah, there's some permanent. We've also got in the district, we've got some land that is untreatable based on, as one of the slides I showed had some very steep land with no topsoil. We've also got some land that is so active that we have problems getting anything growing, and Graham Atkins showed that photo of Barton's Gully.
Sorry.
Carry on.
Go ahead, Kerry.
No, carry on.
I'm just going to jump in here. A lot of what we're talking about are the geological, geographical, kind of nature-based, physiological layers to making these decisions. Some of the other layers that exist that we really need to get through are some of what has been done by humans in the way of policy, in the way of decision making, pre-1990 forest, as an example of what we as a nation have created, and that is now a problem. How do we take pre-1990 forests, pine forests, and remediate those? If the only option that is given to these landowners is to plant forest and leave them there, then what other options are available? So some of the things that Kerry has suggested there around having what might be described as mosaic planting, bits of forest that have reverted to natural, and replanting quicker are some of the options. But I do think that we as communities need to push back and say some of that pre-1990 policy legislation actually is not serving us well anymore. It did in years previous, but now we're in a different context. We're moving into a climate affected world. So what does that mean for us as communities as well?
Yeah, and I think as we were talking, I think we'll hear more from some others who are outside of the agencies responsible, but there's a degree of frustration at how slowly sometimes policy moves, given the climate crisis, given the erosion crisis, given the biodiversity crisis. It feels often like legislation, regulation doesn't keep up with science, or with nature and the human activity on the land and things, and so it's 10 or 20 or 50 years behind where we need to be. But as you say, there's opportunities for the community to advocate more and prioritise these issues. Councillor Kerry Worsnop says her question is, how do we go faster in developing the transitional or diversification steps, or how do we get policy to slow down because the transition is underway already? Our initiatives seem to be largely still in the research phase, while communities are seeing change on the ground and need ways to plan for better outcomes now. Any thoughts on how we speed up the process of good policy making?
Conversation. Just keep the conversation going and keep the sort of the rhetoric.
there is opportunities here at the moment for a collaborative approach with all parties. So the research side of it, landowners, communities, iwi councils, government departments, the whole 9 yards. And in this our region at the moment, that's ripe for that sort of way forward. And the sort of meeting we're having today is the way forward.
I think also that some things can be done around the power structures that currently dominate in this space. And what I mean by that is, government don't know all the answers. We as research institutes don't know all the answers. A lot of the answers are actually coming from the land base. So the landowners who have lived with this, this whenua, with these trees, with these, these problems, these challenges, actually have a greater sense of what is required and what is needed. And I think we as publicly funded structures need to be able to yield some of the power and some of the voice to the landowner groups. And we need to empower and enable more. That's an answer that I would give to Gisborne District Council, is probably sit back, set up in an enabling environment and allow the landowners to have their voice so that they can say what they're seeing and what they understand. I know that that government has a responsibility to make good decisions, and that's great. But sometimes I think government gets too deep into the detail and the decision making, which really should be a space for landowners. So that's why we're moving forward with demonstrations. We're moving forward with regions and with landowner groups that know their stuff, that have an intergenerational sense about what's right for their communities and for their whenua and also their economies.
Awesome. I guess that was one of the goals of this forum and in the ongoing discussion that we want to have as a region. When we went through this permanent carbon forest impacts process with the community, it was pretty clear that there's quite diverse perspectives on what the issues and the answers are, and the challenges to hold us all together as a region and as a country, and keep the conversation going rather than sort of get into our own defensive corners and sort of entrench our position rather than finding ways that we can build consensus and find the stuff that we do agree on, move forward together. Just the last question before our break from Professor John Tunnicliffe. He asks, Kerry, the close coupling and interaction of harvest blocks with river systems seems to be a big problem, both for sediment and slash. Why are there no large buffers at the margins of large and steep cut blocks? What's the framework within which this is regulated?
Yeah, well, going back in time, those forests were established right down to the edge. And of course, as John will know, the gullies and the river systems, Waiapu, where he's done a lot of research, have filled in places like the Rip. The Rip stream now a lot higher up the slope than it was. And initially there were not a great deal in the way of buffers left on that. It's now looked at on a case-by-case approach, and recent approaches have been to establish a permanent buffer of vegetation along them post-harvesting, and probably harvesting slopes in a far more patchwork approach where you're not taking out whole small tributaries at once, that you're taking out only small pieces, but establishing those areas along the margins. But and as John will know, the one of the issues we got here is as those riverbeds build up and the flow attacks the base of the slope, we do get more erosion there at times. So that's a very dynamic situation we have and quite difficult to deal with.
Is your sense, Kerry, that the GDC has enough policy and regulatory tools to deal with those issues?
That's quite a difficult thing. I think we're doing our best on it, but one of the problems is how fast some of those riverbanks are rising and falling. You know, the people from all over the world have come to look at those sites, and you know, the history would show where the woolshed used to be at Pakiroa Station, and it was, you know, in a grassy paddock 1 week, and then debris all around it a few weeks later, and then debris within the woolshed. It's so dynamic. So we've got a really big challenge on our hands with that. So I think we're doing our best on it, but it is a really huge challenge.
Well, thank you again, everybody. We're due to have a break. Sorry, we've got quite a few questions. We'll try to people may be able to answer those in written form as we go on, and we'll just pass back to Mātai, I think, and have a break. We're supposed to finish 10 minutes ago, so we've got 1 minute left before the next session's due to start. We'll see how we go. Thanks
very much, Manu. Yes, we better get our skis on, no pun intended. Thank you very much to Kiri, Ramona and Pat, and also Manu facilitating that discussion. Kia mau tonu maira, as Manu has indicated, we do have a little bit of a break, but we will continue our discussions with our next panellists right after this 10-minute break. Kia mau tonu maira, back soon.